During this afternoon's presentation, please feel free to submit questions to the presenters using the Zoom Q&A panel. After the presentation, a copy and recording will be made available on the webinar event page on Butzel.com. So thank you again for panelists and attendees for attending. And I would like to introduce our moderator, Butzel Long shareholder and Director of Innovation and External Relations, Beth Gothelf. Beth?
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. We have about 80 people over 80 people actually, who signed up for this webinar today. It's an hour and a half. And it is two great timely topics. I will introduce the speakers, both of them at once, and then each speaker will speak, and then we'll take question and answers at the end of the program. So one of my many hats is I'm General Counsel of the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Surface Finishers. And talking to both national and the Michigan chapter, we regularly have a seminar talking about the automotive forecast, where it's going and what we can expect. In addition, and we thought it's time, almost exactly a year ago, we had Mike Wall speak to us about, what's going on, what's the COVID impact, et cetera. And needless to say, a lot has been learned since then. And so, with the COVID, we've seen different things. We've seen production come to a halt, people not wanting to spend money, and then people wanting to spend money. And how has this all impacted the automotive market, and where do we see it going from now? And so we thought it was time to go ahead and do that presentation again, since we like to do it at least annually. And so on that, we're going to have Mike Wall speak. And Mike is, Mike's been great. We've had him for a number of years now. He's Executive Director, Automotive Analysis of IHS Marketing. And he's been doing this for about 2 decades now, with his financial analysis, his various forecasting, consulting, and just all as it relates to manufacturing and automotive. So that's been his primary focus with either the automotive makers, the suppliers, some of the financial firms, and he really brings some good in-depth analysis that we have really appreciated. And we're lucky to have him, because he usually speaks to these enormous audiences. So that's Mike. And then also with the pandemic, we've had a lot of issues about our terms and conditions. First of all, we haven't been able to meet our contract obligations because we can't get the supplies, or we are shut down, or there's issues with our customers, and all these things. And what do we do with all of our terms and conditions? And just in general, what do we do with our terms and conditions? Because a lot of times it's the battle of the forms. Our forms say X and someone else's forms say Y, and you fight back and forth, and there's all these add-in costs that the suppliers put on us, and insurance, etc. And do we just accept it, or do we have some type of ability to fight those? And there's been a lot of question on that. And for the National Association of Surface Finishers, the Job Shop Committee has been looking at this quite a bit. And a number of our other clients have been calling us and asking questions, because it's been really a big issue. And so to address this, we've asked Sheldon Klein of our office to speak on that. Sheldon, he practices a lot of antitrust counseling, litigation, and a lot of these really complex commercial litigations often between automotive suppliers. But he's also counseled a lot of automotive and other manufacturing supply chain, other automotive suppliers and supply chain issues. And in fact, some of you might know Sheldon because he regularly speaks at OESA, OESA on terms and conditions. That's one of their most popular conferences that they have each year, where he goes through the terms and conditions of some of the OEMs, Ford, former Chrysler, GM, Honda, whoever it might be, and talks about them and talks about what it means, what you can do about them, etc. And so it just seemed that he is the perfect person to speak on this topic. Now, and a little bit about me. I think a lot of you know me. I've been general counsel to, as I said, the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Surface Finishers, been active in national for a number of years. We have some of the national people on this webinar right now who's given us great leadership in DC, and have also, advised automotive and a number of you clients on a variety of issues on a regular basis. So that's a little bit of the intro. From that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike now. And then Mike, you're going to take control of the mouse as well for your PowerPoint. And from there, you'll turn it directly over to Sheldon. And for anybody who has questions in the meantime, please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. If you don't want people to know who's asking the question, just chat to me alone, and then I can respond to those. Thank you. Oh, and we're recording this, by the way. So Jonathan, right, you got it recorded so that it will be on our website when we're done.
That's correct, Beth.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Beth, and thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar event. As Beth mentioned, you also have a copy of this presentation as well, so I've already shared that with the folks at Butzel. And yeah, feel free to reference it, and you always reach out with any questions you might have as it relates to our forecast and what we're seeing. I've got this screen showing up here, so hopefully you're not seeing that. Hopefully it's not cropping it out too bad. Let me set the stage. Again, first of all, I'm like Beth, I am looking forward to the point when I can do this in person with everybody as well. And not for the least of which, because Butzel always puts on the best lunch whenever I do these events. So I always look forward to those. We haven't been able to do them in a while. But with that said, let's start discussing sort of the latest outlook. And as Beth mentioned, I think so well, we went through pre-COVID, lockdown, no production, no sales to a great extent, to then the restart process and all of the different things that are impacting us with that. How we think about our forecast, and I've talked about this before, thinking about, forecasting is both a top-down and bottom-up approach. Those top-down impacts, those drivers, economic drivers, GDP, inflation, interest rates, unemployment, all those things that go into really informing customer demand, informing our own desire and wherewithal to go out and buy a vehicle. That's very important as we think about setting at least the top line volumes. And then we build up model by model, plant by plant, in the case of production, model by model, country by country, in the case of sales. So I start off the discussion, let's talk about the economic side of the equation. Last year was a year to forget. We don't want to revisit that from a GDP perspective. It was far deeper than the Great Recession in terms of that 08-09 timeframe. Not for the least rich, because virtually every country went negative from a GDP perspective, with the exception of China. But at China at 2.3% is certainly not all that great shakes in its own right. We flash forward to this year and we're off to the races. Obviously, we've got a lot of stimulus going out there, government stimulus on one hand, and then consumers that are looking to re-engage the economy, frankly, as well. You look at the US for this year, we're at 5.7% GDP growth. Again, we've got a government stimulus program that's kicking off as well, kind of reinvigorating the consumer. But even without that, we were still looking for a pretty sizable snapback as well. Global growth, we're at about 5.1% for this year. And again, you can kind of see how that cascades throughout the various countries and regions as we're seeing. So the underpinnings of this recovery are certainly taking hold, particularly from a demand perspective. Unfortunately, we're slowly transitioning. This is not becoming a demand event anymore. It's becoming a supply event in terms of supply challenges. And again, I included this slide from our semiconductor team just to give everybody at least a lay of the land on the semiconductor front. I mean, we're all, I think, becoming quasi-experts on semiconductors right now, or having to at least become knowledgeable on it, because it is very important. And again, it's the whole spectrum of the chip, if you will, but it goes all the way down to the, the beginnings of that chip, going down to the ingots and the silicon wafers. And more importantly, it's the manufacturing process of the wafers and the chips themselves. It's a very long process. I'll confess, I am no semiconductor expert, and I was ignorant to just the vast amount of time that's involved in this process that is going into creating a chip. And it's important because even though that's a long time period, let's face it, we're punching out vehicles many per hour. And you can see here 1,000 to 1,400 semiconductors per vehicle. You see the scope and the span of what we're talking about. And obviously when the market, when the world stopped producing all things last year for a good 7 to 8 weeks, and then that restart process really did provide a significant disruption. And then you layer in the consumer electronic activity, PlayStation 5s and the next gen Xbox and all the 5G phones, there was a significant draw on demand for chips. So we've been having to fight for that allocation, and that's really what the industry is doing right now, and it's having some disruption. I'll also point out it's not just semiconductors. For anybody and I'm probably preaching to the choir in some cases, we've got port congestion that's impacting shipping. We've got a snowstorm of all things down in Texas that was impacting petrochemical production, if you will, that goes into seat foam and goes into a multitude of components. Steel, sheet steel is on allocation in some cases. We have tight supplies of rubber. There's a whole magnitude of both raw materials and semi-processed materials as well that are all impacting the global automotive supply chain, not even just any given region as well. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. Global light vehicle sales, just to give everybody a frame of reference, last year, 77 million vehicles. Again, a year to forget on that front. We vented about 13 million vehicles from 2019 to 2020. You don't do that easily. That's painful. And certainly deeper than when we saw, again, 0809. 0809, there were still markets that were growing. Last year was, again, largely a contraction just about across the board. Now, again, flash forward to 2021, we are starting to recover. We're digging out of that hole, 84 million units this year. Again, from a global perspective, different markets are behaving differently. I'll touch on some of those dynamics here shortly. As we go beyond this year, though, we do start to see kind of that low single-digit growth pace from a global perspective, getting up to 100 million units by 2028. So we are starting that recovery, but it's going to become a little bit more slow and steady as some of those emerging markets start to improve and the developed markets really start to slow a bit further, coming after a big snapback here this year and maybe even into next year a bit. Now, from a production standpoint, I've alluded to this already a little bit. It is transitioning from a demand event to a supply event. The demand has come back with a vengeance in many markets, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Production-wise, it was a tough hit last year. Again, down 16%. That was certainly exceeded how much we were down in sales. We were down about 14% or so in sales. Why is that? Well, we took down production for close to 2 months in some cases, 7 to 8 weeks in some cases, and that was a big hit in and of itself. Then there's the reboot process, which in some cases can be slow and steady. Don't forget, we have COVID containment measures, other things that can also sap utilization and productivity. And then we run into some of the shortages, the component shortages. And that's been the battle we've been fighting right now. I'm kind of a glass half full and half empty guy on the one hand. Half full side, demand has been very resilient in some key markets. Half empty side, we got to be able to produce to that. And that's where the challenges are right now. So it's creating some near-term volatility. And it's interesting when you go flashback to 0809, again, I like to draw, I like to go back and refer to prior events to kind of inform the conversation. 0809, it was a much longer time period to get back to quote unquote normal on the demand side. It was a good 4 years or so, depending on the market. Here, it's like a light switch, back to normal as of like August, September of last year, but yet production has to catch up with it. And that's why we were probably a little bit quote unquote lucky back in 0809 that we could kind of gradually go through that recovery process. Here, we're having to do it almost, again, light switch time right off the bat. And that really kind of informs what we're seeing right now in terms of Production, our forecast, this just looks at Q1 from our latest March forecast versus December, how it's changed. Because this is going to, I think, help inform kind of what we're seeing, both from a supply chain perspective on the semiconductor front, but then also how it's having different impacts across different markets. I bring this up to show mainland China as an example. You can see the orange there, semiconductor impact, about 350,000 units. But yet, when you look at the net impact in our forecast now versus December, it's much less, just over 100,000 units lower with our latest forecast. Well, why is that? Well, light commercial vehicle activity actually outperformed in the first quarter. There were ways that China was able to kind of surmount some of those semiconductor pressures, if you will. However, you look at North America, it's a different case. North America, the semiconductor impact about 260,000 units, but yet you look at the overarching impact, March versus December, it's well in excess of 500,000 units. Why is that? Again, snowstorm down in Texas knocks out natural gas production for a period of time, having to shut down plants. Knocks out petrochemical for a period of time as well. That's impacting some of that supply chain. So there's some broader impacts that even extend beyond semiconductor. And that's the name of the game right now. We're having to navigate some pretty treacherous waters amongst various regions. Again, much more on the production side, much more on the supply side versus the demand side. Now we'll talk about some of the international markets just a little bit further. Mainland China here, and I won't spend a ton of time on this, but other than to say, last year we're down about 4%, could have been a lot worse. This year we are off to the races. They are outperforming, I would even argue, even with semiconductor, and it's still a real concern, but still up about 5.5%, 5.6%. And again, we've seen some strength in light commercial vehicle, especially at the beginning part of the year. That'll wane to be sure. But by the same token, again, it's still it's a decent growth outlook for production in China this year, even when we think and we take into consideration some of the semiconductor issues that are still facing the market. Europe is a different beast altogether, and it's kind of unique versus U.S. and China. By that I mean we don't expect Europe to get back to pre-crisis levels anytime within this near to intermediate term. In fact, it's kind of borne out here. Why is that? Well, it was a deep cut last year, down about 23%. And you see a snapback this year, about 14.5%. But the market is different. The market in West Europe in particular is different. And frankly, pre-COVID, we did not have any sizable growth in demand for the market. Anyway, when you think about some of the demand and demographic, some of the demographic conditions in the market were not as conducive to vehicle demand, new vehicle demand in particular. And then you layer in CO2 emission requirements that are expected to boost vehicle pricing. And now more recently, we still have some of the knock-on effects of still kind of recurring lockdowns that are impacting demand in the extreme near term. So again, Europe is one to continue to watch. There's semiconductor impact as well, but also COVID containment is still, I think, playing a role in that market. Let's pivot and talk about the US because, and I know I've got a lot of folks on the line here that are particularly impacted by and interested in North America and US. So we'll spend a bit of time here. US light vehicle sales outlook. This is the good news story. And again, I'm seeing both sides of the coin right now. We're having challenges on the production side to be sure, but demand has come back with a vengeance, retail demand specifically. And we saw that really as we emerged from the COVID shutdowns, and Beth, I think, alluded to it perfectly. Folks that still have money, folks are coming back to market in both new and used market too. If anybody's been looking for a used car, such as me, for a kid, it's not an easy endeavor right now. So new and used are very tight supplies, and there's a robust demand right now. This year for new vehicle sales, we're looking at 16.3 million units. That's an all-in number, so that's fleet and retail. And fleet has been challenged, especially daily rental, and it will remain challenged as we see business travel in particular still remain depressed. But even with that, we're seeing some very strong resiliency with retail sales. So again, that's something to keep in mind as we're thinking about, again, the wherewithal within the market. We will sort out the supply chain side. It's going to may take a little bit more time, but demand is still proving to be quite resilient. So again, very positive there. Now let's flip to North American production. This is where the news is a little bit more tough, a little more challenging. Here we look at our March forecast versus our December forecast. March is in dark blue, and then December is in light blue by month. And you can see how we had to revise down, especially in our first half of the year forecast. We took about 754,000 units out of the forecast, owing to the semiconductor pressures and increasingly some of those other supply chain pressures. Now, back half of the year, we baked in about an additional 349,000 units. Net though, if you look at our prior forecast versus now, we ended up taking it down by about 400,000 units to 15.8. And we'll see that in the next slide here in a moment. A couple things to watch for. Summer shutdowns right now are kind of a wild card. We're starting to see automakers pulling back on summer shutdowns, meaning they're going to shrink those summer shutdowns as much as possible to try to outperform and overbuild where they can. All that's going to be determined by, do we have supply of these, on the one hand, semiconductors, but just think raw materials and parts and components. So that's going to be a big wild card. I do think there's some potential though for continued compression in those summer shutdowns. So I'll be thinking about that as you're looking at your releases going out to July and August and planning for some of that. If we can get the steady supply on some of these subcomponents, that is going to help, because again, we do have that underlying demand. That's really borne out here too when we look at North American light vehicle production by country, by year going out into our forecast horizon. Again, we're at 15.8 million units this year, and again, as early as January, February, we were closer to about 16.2. It was sort of a classic pre-crisis level. And again, were it not for the supply side, we'd be there already. So again, I would definitely liken this to more of a V-shaped recovery, but, and the big but in this is supply chain. It all comes back to supply chain. A quicker snapback than Great Recession with a big old asterisk. Component shortages, labor availability. Again, all of that is playing a role here, and it is tempering some of that enthusiasm, at least in the extreme near term. Again, the good news is we're going to defer some of that. It's not going to be gone completely. By 2022, we're looking at 16.8 million units, and you can see that mid 16 million unit range well through our forecast horizon. I get asked quite a bit though. A couple things. One other thing to mention is we still have to rebuild inventory. We estimate there's probably about 500,000 units of inventory that we could refill in the pipeline at dealerships right now. That could change a little bit. Do dealers get away with kind of living with less inventory? Do we learn to live in a new, maybe lower inventory environment? I think to some extent we will, but we've got a lot of inventory to make up still to that point. The question I do get is, how do we get to 17 million? And great question. And I think it's imminently doable, to be sure. How is that going to happen? We've got a lot of battery electric vehicle launches coming down the pike. How do those perform in the market? We're seeing more regionalization, so we're the potential to bring more capacity back on shore and bring more vehicle production back on shore as well, including import substitution. Again, being closer to your customer is always a positive there as well. And then again, further Mexico development, especially with USMCA, I think there's some opportunity there as well. So keep that in mind as we think about that intermediate to longer term forecast going forward. North American light vehicle production here, the tail of the tape. I won't go into detail. I leave this with you as more of just something that's a takeaway. We have a lot of vehicles launching this year, a lot of high profile vehicles, Bronco, Hummer EV, Grand Cherokee, Wagoneer, Grand Wagoneer, need I say more? A lot of high profile vehicles, and then a whole host of new domestic transplant manufacturer vehicles as well. Again, the good news is growing by about 2.7 million units. The bad news, if you call it that, could be better, should be better. Again, if not, were it not for some of the supply chain pressures right now. We look at production by country. Again, a couple of interesting takeaways. I referenced 2019 to 2028. Again, forgive me in advance. I'm pulling 2020 out of the mix because it just screws up the numbers royally. It kind of creates an aberration. So I kind of go back to a pre-crisis versus post. And you can see here, we are looking for some sizable growth in U.S. light vehicle production by 850,000 units. A new plant for Toyota and Mazda coming online and ramping up. Some other new capacity being launched and really more efficient use of existing capacity, new battery electric vehicle launches. Got about 76,000 units of growth in Mexico. And again, watch that space. I think there's some upside potential there as well. And then you look at Canada, down about 450,000 units. I put an asterisk there in the sense that a wild card and also a positive for Canada. We're starting to see Canada possibly become a hub for EV development in manufacturing. We saw this with both General Motors and Ford in their union negotiations. So it's one of those things that if we start to see some of those EVs taking hold sooner rather than later in that adoption curve, there's some potential there as well to see a bit more critical mass in Canada from that perspective. We look at production by automaker type. A couple things to take away here. Again, I've been pointing this out for a little while now. 2019 was something interesting to see. The first year we saw parity between the Detroit 3 and the transplants, sort of equal presence in terms of production, 50-50. And then going forward, frankly, it's going to become a little bit more transplant biased. That's not meant to be a knock on the D3 at all. In fact, that core production of 7.8 million units is huge. That's going to be very profitable production for those automakers in production you want to quote on. And the growth that we see with the transplants, again, is more of that import substitution and localization. That light blue there, you see there are the new EV startups, and there's a lot of them. Certainly Tesla's in there, but it's also Rivian. And in fact, that dovetails well into my next slide where we start talking about those startups. One of the toughest things to forecast in this industry right now, and I'm not trying to be a whiner, it just is what it is. It's tough because everybody's jumping into the water. And it's great to see automotive be kind of in vogue, don't get me wrong, but it's tricky to forecast. And you can see it's literally an A to Z type of discussion. Everybody from Arrival to Zoox. The one A that's not in there is Apple explicitly, so that's a bit of a wild card in and of itself. But you can see here it's varying production volumes. Obviously, Rivian jumps right off the page. It's the highest, and we don't have Tesla in here owing more to scale, and they're not really a startup anymore per se. But Rivian, we've got Rivian in there, partnerships with Amazon and Ford. We've got both traditional kind of the vehicles en masse, like sport utility and pickups being featured by Rivian, and then also commercial vehicles, like commercial vehicles in their Amazon vans. Then you have a kind of this mix of both sort of micro players or more autonomous type players, and then also players that are kind of more aligned towards the commercial or quasi-commercial front, all with varying levels of production and demand expectations as well. So again, it's something that's just as a little primer to kind of use to gauge against, and we're always happy to engage in conversation too around expectations for some of these manufacturers. And there's more to come. Believe me, there are a lot more still in the queue. I love to talk about this slide because it doesn't get talked about enough. I've talked about it to this group many a times, probably till I'm blue in the face, vehicle launch activity. And we saw something happen last year, obviously with the COVID crisis, when we saw the lockdowns, we saw activity go down because frankly, as we saw vehicle delays kick in, it pushed some of those launches out. Now we're starting to see sort of that bubble of new launches coming down the pipe. 2023 and 2024 are going to be big launch years, but even the intervening years are going to be important and consequential in their own right. A lot of battery electric vehicle activity, 55 all new nameplates, and that does not even factor in what are sort of the multi-energy nameplates where they also have internal combustion engines, and it doesn't factor in those imported vehicles either. What we are seeing is some stretching of other programs though, to allow for more time to amortize those program costs, because frankly, we weren't able to amortize it over as many units last year. So stretching where you can, taking in and those profitable programs where you can, and benefiting from that, but really having to stretch in some cases, but then also trying to hold as close as you can to the actual launch activity on the battery electric front as well, because we know we've got a lot of vehicles coming down the pipe on that front. Let's talk about electrics a little bit. I got a couple slides on this before I conclude my portion of the presentation. This is going to be something to watch very closely because, and we've been talking about it for a while, the models are coming. I feel like Paul Revere, the models are coming, they are coming. And they're coming with a vengeance. The next 24 to 36 months are going to be real sporty, real quick. And you can see here, model count is in the green bars on this left-hand chart, and then the battery electric vehicle volume itself. We're going to be growing. This is just North American launches. Again, I'm not factoring in imported vehicles and the like. We're going to be growing to about 80 models in the North American market. Where it becomes complicated for suppliers is the right-hand side of the slide. Volume per nameplate. This is an industry that's born on hundreds of thousands of parts per vehicle, whether you're supplying a Silverado or Sierra or F-Series. Even the average internal combustion vehicle is probably closer to 75 to 80,000 units per nameplate, somewhere about there. In a battery electric reality, at least in the near to intermediate term, we're going to probably be in the 25,000 unit range, 25, maybe 30. It's a new reality. We're going to have to, and not all of these vehicles are going to hit in the same tone and tenor, in the same volume as others. So something to keep in mind as we start. And we're not saying don't quote me. These are going to be the models to quote because the industry is shifting rather rapidly towards battery electric. Internal combustion isn't going away, at least in the intermediate, even to the longer term to some extent. But battery electric is coming, and it's already here to some extent, but it's going to be coming with a gusto here in the not too distant future at all. And that sets up the stage, the sort of the comparison North America to Europe to Greater China. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. Here we look at it 2020, 2025, and 2030. Production by propulsion type. And the area to key in on here is that pastel green. That's true battery electric. And then the kind of darker green, I guess, for lack of a better term, is your full hybrid. And embedded within there is plug-in hybrid as well. But the key thing to watch here, Europe and Greater China, those are markets that are most definitely kind of pushing emissions requirements and really making a big push towards battery electric adoption. Now, we still need the consumers to also provide something of a pull, but there's a governmental push there. North America, we haven't seen that fully vetted yet. It's coming though. Biden administration's already talked about, obviously back boosting vehicle charging infrastructure. Yep, check, that's going to be coming. Likely some additional purchase incentives or expansion of the program. I do think that's going to be coming as well. So some of that is yet to materialize. I think there could be some upside, frankly, to some of those battery electric vehicle numbers, especially in 2030, because that could be the window that we start to see the administration really start to target, sort of 2026 to 2030. So keep that in mind as you start thinking about that. But by and large, that's sort of why North America does look a bit more different than Europe and Greater China, but it is starting to evolve. And again, a lot of that's being brought upon us as well due to a lot of that new vehicle launch activity that we're seeing on the battery electric front. So there's still a lot more activity yet to be had, and there's still be a lot of quoting opportunities on that front to be sure. With that, I appreciate the opportunity again, and I'll be available for questions at the end, but I will be sure to turn it over to Sheldon for his portion of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, while Sheldon's getting up his PowerPoint, I just want to remind everybody to put the any questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab. Thanks.
Okay, Beth, can you confirm that everyone can see me? Or see my PowerPoint, more importantly?
We can see you and the PowerPoint.
Wonderful. Good afternoon to everybody. The others have said how they can't wait to do this again in person. That would be good, but it would even be better even if it weren't in person, if I could see who I was talking to. Still haven't quite gotten used to talking to a computer. I'm going to start by saying this is my first opportunity to speak to this group as far as I can recall, but I speak to industry groups a lot. And something I always do is go to the group website, and almost all of them, like your group, have magazines or newsletters and the like. And I like to look at them to see what's keeping you all up at night, perhaps to help me frame a better presentation. When I opened up the new version of Product Finishing Magazine, what do I see except for a long article on avoiding webinar disasters? And it uses words like regrettable and unprepared and dull and disaster. And I wondered why when Beth asked me to speak on the Battle of the Forms, why she didn't share with me that somehow I had to do this without being regrettable and unprepared and dull and a disaster. But I'm going to try, and she'll make it up to me someday. So let's get started. Something I'm not going to talk about during my presentation, all in the Q&A, we might touch on it, is what should be in your contract. What should your warranty provision say? What should price provision say, et cetera. There's a number of reasons, in part because it's really not one size fits all. You don't all have the exact same business. You don't all stay awake at night about the same things. But separate from that, I know that there is a committee working on model terms and conditions, and model terms are great. But as someone who, among other things, works in the antitrust area, I feel obligated to say that model terms are great, but you as competitors can't agree amongst yourselves on the terms on which you are going to do business without significant antitrust risk. So take that into account as you decide on how you're going to form your terms and conditions.
Sheldon?
Yes.
Is it possible for you to click on your left so that your left panel doesn't show and they only see your slide.
Oh,
So it's a little
okay.
bit different for
Thank
them.
you for correcting me. I didn't need to do that. I needed to do that. Now you can see the full page slide, correct?
Yes, and Products Magazine thanks you for your comment and wants to know if you will do an article for them. So
Uh,
we'll get to that later. Get back to the program.
I thought you were going to ask me to be the centerfold, but I guess an article will do instead. So we're going to talk through seeing through the battle of the forms. And I suspect that most of you have heard about the battle of the forms. Probably a good chunk of you have a general notion of what it means. But what it comes down to as practical matters, what I've subtitled this slide, which is I agree to what? You go about your business, perhaps without a lot of attention to the terms of the contract. You throw forms back and forth to each other. Your customer says whatever the question is, I win. And you tell your customer whatever the question is, I win. And other than that, the forms go to a wastebasket to die. But in the meantime, you're doing lots of business together. That's the battle of the forms. So what I want to cover in this presentation in the relatively few minutes I have is first to understand how contracts are formed, then to elaborate on the battle of the forms, and more importantly, how to engage in it, how to hold your own in the battlefield. And then finally go on to discuss parts of the contract that might not be in either of your forms, but nevertheless become part of your contract through various mechanisms. So between these things, you hopefully won't still be left saying, I agreed to what? You might be left with contracts that you don't like, but that's different than a contract that surprises you to learn what you agreed to. So contract formation. All of we lawyers on the phone took a contracts class the first day of law school, and about the first thing that we learned was to form a contract. There's the mirror image rule. Someone known as the offeror says, I make an offer. Someone known as the acceptor or the offeree says, I accept your offer. And bingo, you have a contract, provided certain things are in there. If instead the offeree says, I accept your offer, except I need to be paid 21 days instead of 32 days, you don't have a contract, you've made a counteroffer. And until the offeror comes back and say, okay, 32 days, it's a deal, you don't have a deal. They have to be mirror images of each other. In the real world, form language is exchanged. No one ever looks at the documents, as I alluded. But in the meantime, you're doing business. You've sold thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of widgets over days, months, years. It's not very practical to say, well, we've done all this, but there's no contract there. And so there needs to be legal rules for figuring out what the contract is when there's not something like a piece of paper to which both sides have put their pen on to say, here's the deal. That's what the battle of the forms is. So the obvious starting question is, do I have a contract at all? And what I've put up here is section 2204 of the Uniform Commercial Code. In a couple slides, I'll spend about 30 seconds talking about what Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, or UCC, is. But I just want to demonstrate how clear it all is. Subpart 1, how do I make a contract? Well, you make it in any manner that shows an agreement, including conduct. So you don't have to say anything, you don't have to do anything in particular. If, for example, you've started doing the business with each other, well, there must be a contract, so you've got a contract. Well, when did I make this contract? Well, we don't need to know that. That's subpart 2. You have a contract even though no one knows when it was made. And subpart 3 is, well, what's in the contract? We never agreed on all sorts of things. Well, that doesn't matter. You can have a contract even if there's lots of terms that have never been decided, as long as you intended to make a contract. So it's not nearly as tidy and tangible of a thing as what the contract's that thing sitting in my desk drawer necessarily. But that's a function of necessity, not of lawyers being dingbats. The necessity being you're buying stuff, you're selling stuff, you're paying bills. You're dealing with people who sued you because your widget broke. You're doing all of those things. And there must be something that dictates who owes what to whom, both monetarily and otherwise in that business. So you may infer from all that, rule one, lawyers are good and actual agreement is better. This quoted language is from the leading treatise in this area. I won't read it to you. I've highlighted in red the most pertinent portions of which perhaps the best advice in there is if you can't agree on a contract if it matters to you, and if you don't or can't have an extra martini. There is no way, there's no magic words that a lawyer can use that will make you happy with the contract that you're working under, unless you've actually reached agreement with your counterparty, with your customer or your supplier, as the case might be, on that contract. So what is the battle of the forms? Well, this is a chart, and I always credit the authors of this chart because someone did a brilliant job, but for some reason it fell off of this slide, so I don't remember who created it. It wasn't me. And I don't expect any of you to do an eye chart of this, both because the type is too small and because it's much too complicated, but it's actually about as simple as you can possibly make it. It doesn't capture every nuance, but it's actually pretty good. And you see in box one, the box in the lighter blue, the first question, determine applicable law, which what that translates to, are you talking about goods, stuff you can pick up, or services? The rules are different depending on that. We talked about the UCC a moment ago. The UCC applies to goods. Common law, which is to say not the UCC, but bunches of cases that have been decided over hundreds and hundreds of years, apply if you're not talking about goods. Then you have to identify the offer and the acceptance because it matters in terms of sorting it out. Who is it that made an offer? Who is it that made an acceptance? And as we'll see, it's not nearly that simple or obvious. And then depending on the answer, so those first two questions, we get into these complicated snake charts, and we'll pay attention to them more in a couple of minutes. So goods or services. Again, in terms of most of your business, if you are buying raw parts and then finishing them and then reselling the finished parts, that's a sale of goods. If someone is shipping you parts and paying you a penny a part to coat them without you ever taking title to those parts, that is a service. And again, it matters. And sometimes it's a mixture, and the law applies what's called the predominant purpose test. If you hire someone to put a roof on your house, are you paying for shingles or are you paying for the installation of shingles? Obviously, you're paying for both. Well, is it a good or a service? Well, sometimes it's hard to say. Where's most of the value would be the easiest way to translate it. And that mixed purpose may apply to some of you. I don't know. Offer acceptance. We talked before, mirror image rule. Someone makes an offer, someone accepts it, contract. What's an offer? Well, this again is language cut and pasted from an authority. An offer is a manifestation of willingness to enter into a bargain. So if you say something, if you communicate something to someone that leads them to think, if I say, I accept, there's a contract, then you must have made an offer. If the person to whom you made that offer it responds by saying, I accept, then they must understand that a contract's been made. Again, not terribly clear, and it's not that tidy. You receive a request for proposal or an invitation to bid. Is that an offer? Well, if you get the request for proposal and you write back and say, I agree, I accept, do you have a contract? Probably not. So it would seem that maybe that's not an offer, but it is the first communication. You make your bid or your proposal or quotation or whatever. Is that an offer? Well, if your customer says, we've got a deal, do you have a deal? Is that proposal have enough in there to make it a contract? Well, that's going to vary. If all your proposal says is 7 cents a widget, probably not. If your proposal includes robust terms and conditions, maybe. And then down the road, you start doing business and your customer sends you a purchase order. Is that the offer? Well, if your bid was the offer, it can't be an offer. It must be an acceptance or a counter offer or something. It becomes very complicated, especially in manufacturing supply chains. And there's a fair amount of case law in this area about what counts as the offer and what counts the acceptance. And it's not an academic question just for theologians. It matters in terms of how the battle of the forms is going to come out. So with those two basic questions, and again, that's box 1 and box 2. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Forgive me. If you are, I've put a red box around this upper part of section 3. That is the portion of the box that applies to if you are a seller of services. And basically, if you're a seller of services, it is what's called the last shot rule. You'll see that in the caption to that section. You say A, your customer says A, you say okay as long as you add B. The customer says okay, but you've got to add Q as well. And that's the last communication before you start buying and selling and shipping and making goods. Then Q would be the last shot in that exchange, and whatever's in the last shot would the battle of the forms would say is your contract. As we'll see in a minute, that suggests if you're selling services, it might be important to get in the last shot. Now, I wish it was as neat and tidy as that makes it sound, and all you needed to know was make sure you get in the last word and you'll always win. Well, it doesn't work that way, but it will give you a leg up. If you're a seller of goods, it is the bottom box, which I've also outlined in red here, where it says UCC, which again is Uniform Commercial Code. The very top box where it says if either party is not a merchant, well, if you're selling your lawnmower to your neighbor, that applies, but that's not of any interest to anyone here. So I'm going to move into the bottom of it, which is what applies to what the code calls merchants, folks who are in the business is all that it means to be a merchant under the Uniform Commercial Code. They sort through in a series of very complicated and often ambiguous questions. You take the two communications. Let's call one an offer, one an acceptance. Do they differ? Yes. Are they different? Does the second piece of paper have differing terms or new terms? You got to decide whether it's differing or new. Well, depending on that, you go to another series of questions. And then depending on which state you're in, if you can agree on which is the offer and which is the acceptance, if you can agree on whether the differences are differing terms or new terms, and if you can agree on lots of other things, then depending on which state you're in, you'll know what the contents of your contract are. Which brings us back to the scholar who happens to be, that we looked at before, who happens to be J.J. White, who's been at the University of Michigan since probably longer than any of us on this phone have been at least an adult. Why he advises there's no magic words that work other than buying insurance, don't capitalize the company, and drink heavily. These are rules that can give you a leg up. They might give you in the event of a fight, but they are absolutely no substitute for actually dickering with your customer or dickering with your supplier and documenting what the deal is. If you don't do that, don't get mad at the lawyers, don't get mad at the judges. How in the heck is the judge supposed to know what the deal is if you and your customer can't agree as to what it is? You're putting unfair expectations on them. And we all do the best we can with what we're given, but sometimes we're not given a lot in terms of figuring out what the deal is. I'm going to focus for the most part on when you are a seller, whether of goods or services. What are best practices? Well, first of all, label it an offer. Expressly, there's offer isn't a magic word, but you want to send the message that, and might as well use the word offer, I am offering to do business with you on these terms. Again, we've seen it matters what's the offer and what's the acceptance. Have your offer include your terms and conditions of sale, which implies that you should have terms and conditions of sale. You can't have a battle of the forms. There could be no reason to disagree as to what the contract is if there's only one piece of paper, which is your customer's forms, and you've never proposed any different terms. So designated an offer, have your offer say it's subject to my terms and conditions of sale, have those terms. Bullet 4 is, as with any contract, you got to make sure the language is clear. I mean, a contract is something more than ink on paper. It's ink on paper that clearly communicates the deal in such a way that you avoid or minimize the possibility of dispute when the contract becomes relevant in the real world. If you incorporate into your documentation things like a request for quotations or external documents, be careful in what you're incorporating. You get a 40-page request for quotations, a request for quotation, you say we incorporate, it includes your request. Well, one page of the request is the specifications, which is all that you intended to incorporate, and the other 39 pages are words that say whatever the question is, I win, I being your customer, you've created confusion or worse. In your communications, you should object to your customer's terms if they add additional or different terms. My partner, Jim Bruno, who I suspect a number of you have seen talk on this or related subjects, sums it up very nicely. You have to, at every opportunity, to say my way or the highway. And again, there is better and worse legal language, which I'm not going to get into, but ultimately you have to communicate, these are the terms on which I am willing to do business, period. Not willing to do it on other terms. I'm not willing to do it on new terms. It helps in the battle of the forms. And then finally, especially for services where the last shot rule applies, try and get in the last word. This is some sample language for your quotation, and really in a few sentences, it kind of says everything that was said, or pretty much everything that was said in the last slide with the 5 or 6 bullet points, whatever it was. It's not complicated, this language, and it's by no, this isn't a complete contract. It's a few sentences that say, this is an offer. These are the terms on which I'm willing to do business, and those are the only terms on which I'm willing to do business. What documents count when it's time to sort out what is the contract? Well, it's going to depend a lot on what the documents are and what the sequence are. But in general, if I'm your lawyer and you call me and say, we're fighting about what the terms of the contract are, these are the things I'm going to ask you to send me. The first 4 bullets are very highly likely to be relevant. Things like correspondence and emails, I'm going to want to see it in the event that there's real confusion and uncertainty as to what the terms of the contract are. Those might tip the balance one way or the other, but it isn't where you should start in understanding the terms. Likewise for an invoice. Beyond these pieces of paper, beyond what you can scan and email to me, there are things which I've labeled beyond the 4 corners. That is the 4 corners of the paper. First of all, the law, and this is especially the case under the UCC, which is to say the sale of goods, it has gap fillers. You haven't agreed on all of the terms of doing business, but nevertheless, as I say, you're doing business. The UCC fills in gaps. As odd as it seems, you may not have reached you may not reach an agreement on price, and there are instances when that happens. Well, it's a reasonable price. You haven't reached an agreement on where the goods are to be delivered. Well, it's the seller's place of business where title passes. I mean, there's lots of others of these gap fillers. The point isn't the particulars, but rather the general point that if you don't agree on a provision, there are times in which the law will write one in for you based on its best guess is what you probably intended, but best guess isn't necessarily what you intended if you never put it down to paper. I guess the one worth looking at is the final one, warranties. If you are a seller of goods especially, it is not enough to stay silent. By staying silent, there are certain warranties that are automatically read into the transaction, and they're not necessarily warranties that are helpful to the seller. So your writing absolutely should include what warranties are given and aren't given, and you'll often see the word disclaimer or something of the sort. That is the portion of the contract that says, in substance, the only warranties are given you are the ones that I wrote down. You cannot imply unwritten warranties into the contract. But again, unless you say that, unless you say you can't imply unwritten warranties, the court will imply those unwritten warranties, to your surprise, perhaps. Beyond the gap fillers, well, the courts, the UCC and courts, especially when the paper is unclear or non-existent, will look to what's called course of dealing. That's what the parties have done in other contracts. You've been doing business with customer Jones for years, and for years and years, you've always, under different contracts, you always do something the same way. Bills are always paid 30 days from the date of invoicing, even though the contract doesn't say when bills are to be paid. Well, that's a course of dealing that will be important in deciding when bills are to be paid. Course of performance is the label used for under the same contract. You've had a contract in place for a year, and 48 straight weeks you paid the bills on 45 days. That suggests that it's 45 days under that contract. Usage of trade is another word for industry standards. We didn't decide it in the paper, but this is just the way it's done in my industry. Ask anyone, they'll understand that's the way it's done. The paper itself will often reference things like quality manuals, packaging guidelines, shipping guidelines, etc. Those are going to matter. In addition, there are, of course, the gap fillers. And finally, the contract's going to come from if and when it becomes time to go through to fight the battle of the forms, which terms survived that battle. From these 8 or 9, however many it is, bullet points, you will patch together the contract. Hopefully it's only one bullet point that matters, which is the piece of paper in which you and your customer have agreed on everything important and signed. But if you fail to do that, the terms can come to you from a lot of directions. So what are the takeaways? First, you don't want to fight the battle of the forms. If at all possible, negotiate an agreement with your customer that addresses the things that keep you up at night, must-haves. I can, obviously it's going to vary from business to business, from customer to customer. It is my experience, and I spend a lot of time doing this. It is more possible to negotiate with customers than was my experience a half dozen years ago. Now, it's going to matter, of course. Is it the same negotiating with General Motors as the small business that down the street? Probably not as easy. Do you have some special technology or other advantages that gives your customer a good reason to try and make you happy rather than to go to the competitor down the street? Of course it matters. I mean, these are all business issues that dictate that are going to dictate the outcome or at least guide the outcome of the negotiations. There are occasions where probably the smart thing to do is to say, I'm not going to pay any attention to the piece of paper. I'm not going to try and reach agreement on what the terms are. If any of this comes to matter, we'll fight then, and hopefully the court will see it my way. That might be a good decision, but I wouldn't build a business plan on that strategy. Certainly, it's not something you should do unwittingly, or you should do simply on the presumption of this paper is just a bunch of legal BS. I don't have to pay any attention to it. Let's just get the money coming in the door, and we'll keep our fingers crossed from there. If you can't reach agreement, it helps to understand the battle of forms. It helps to understand the rules of engagement. More important than you, at least for many of you, is the people who are fighting the battle need to understand it. If all that comes out, if hopefully some of you say, oh, this is important information, I'm glad that I now understand the battle of the forms. If you don't tell your people that are actually negotiating contracts, I'm glad to have entertained you, but haven't particularly helped your business. Well-written agreements are a cost-effective risk management tool. Again, a contract that's ink signed and extensively negotiated, but doesn't answer the important questions that you're going to have to answer in the life of the business relationship, and doesn't tell the judge there's one and only one way to resolve this dispute, is not a well-written agreement, and it's generally being penny wise and pound foolish if you think that resources, your time, money you pay to your attorney, etc., aren't invested both in good purchasing documents and in good purchasing processes. This is process as much as it is content that's going to dictate the battle of the forms. Again, if you don't have terms of sale, I would consider that a serious business shortcoming. You should have them. They should be good ones. They should be incorporated into every piece of paper related to contract formation. And finally, and now I'm repeating myself, although I guess it's a takeaway, so I should be repeating myself. It's no one's fault but your own. If a court or a jury or whomever doesn't understand the deal that you intended, if it was never appropriately documented and communicated. And with this, and I think I was roughly on time for my time slot, I hope I was, I think we're going to turn to questions. I'm going to stop sharing and turn the ball back over to Beth.
Great. Thank you. You were actually perfect with your timing. And at this point, we are going to take a quick commercial break from Phil Brockman. Phil, who some of you may know, is a surface finisher, and he's member of the, he's a former board member of the National Association of Surface Finishers, and he is also on the NASF Job Shop Committee. So I want to turn it over to Phil for his quick commercial break.
Hey, thank you, Beth. Yes, like Beth, Mike, and Sheldon. Hey, by the way, great information. Really enjoyed it. Good presentation, learned a lot. I also want to say thank you to the NASF Michigan chapter and all of Butzel along for all the help all the years. The Job Shop Committee that I'm a part of, there's other members on the Job Shop Committee. We're getting a little bit more active in NASF. And there's other companies such as Anoplate, ASCO, City Plating. You also have Casey Jones, Sheffield Plating, Precision Plating, Kim Plate, Epner Plating, and then other people that attend the meetings as well are Jeff Broussard, Jeff Hannibal, Christian. You guys all know Christian. Steve Brown occasionally will participate in our meetings.
Jeff
Some of the things
Hannibal's on the phone, is in this conference, by the way, and most of the people you mentioned are here too.
Yes. So one of the things that's kind of why we're talking is the Job Shop Committee is trying to create some tools for job shops. And one of the things that we've been discussing are terms and conditions, and there's some caveats to that that are going to make that difficult for us to do. We're trying to make it some talking points that you want to have for T's and C's. We're trying to roll that out, but it would be a voluntary, kind of be like a template or a guide, things like that. Some of the other things that the job shop main goal is to get more engagement on a national level and on a local chapter level. And T's and C's, just like what Beth and her group is talking about here, are topics that can get job shops or any company, customer, supplier in trouble. Just not having an upfront contract with your customer and reading the terms and conditions, or having terms of sale. So all great points. So we are working on that. The other thing the job shop committee is working on is a wage and benefit type survey for all the job shop members of NASF. And eventually the first one we're trying to roll it out in 2021. It'll be a 2-phase of the wage and benefit. And then later on in 2022, we hope to add additional questions in the survey for job shops that are more plater specific and things like that. And we are going to make the job on the wage and benefit be applicable to metal finishing industry as well. That's all I wanted to talk about. Just let you guys know that the job shop committee does for NASF is out there. Thank you much. Great talk, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. And by the way, our new executive director, Ellen, is also with us today. So a lot of you haven't met her yet. Ellen, if you can take yourself off a video and just wave to people. There you go. So now you know what Ellen looks like, and you know, she's been terrific. All right, I've got a lot of questions. I have a number of them in the chat and or in the Q&A. Feel free to add more in there. And then I have about 8 of them that aren't in the Q&A that others have given me. And so I think I'll start with this second question because I haven't addressed this issue since 10 minutes before the webinar started. In other words, it's a popular issue that we face daily. And the question is, what if the service includes intellectual property use or the sale of intellectual property with service contracts as part of the sale? And so Sheldon, you want to take that one?
I can only speak in general terms, which is intellectual property is a lot harder to contract for, harder in the sense of it requires careful thought and careful drafting, because it's a lot harder to identify and define intellectual property than, you know, a washer or whatever the case might be. In addition, a particular washer can only be my property or your property, or the buyer's property or the seller's property. It can't be both. Intellectual property by its very nature, a lot of people can have the same intellectual property because there's nothing tangible. It's an idea, and a lot of people can have an idea in their head. So the bottom line answer is, if you have valuable intellectual property, absolutely spend the time necessary to protect it contractually, and not to be insulting, but or at the risk of being insulting. Contracting for intellectual property is not for amateurs. I mean, I'll tell you, there are things that are beyond my comfort level. For example, we've got specialists in the office that specialize in cryptocurrency. You know, if you come to me with a cryptocurrency problem, the only thing I'm doing is getting the right guy on the phone, not being an amateur in dealing with some very complicated intellectual property issues.
Thanks, Sheldon. Actually, I'll add a little bit more, because I know some of you use processes that are patented and you want to protect those. And some of you have developed them on your own or with somebody else, and that contract kind of defines who owns it. And then other of you, you know, might have some type of agreement with your customer. And then the ownership is in that agreement as well. And so you really have to, I think that Sheldon has given you sage advice about you do need to protect your intellectual property. It's really important because that's a big value to you, and you need specialists. We have people that specialize, but yes, we have a whole bunch of intellectual property attorneys, but we have a couple niche people that just have engineering degrees or other degrees, and that's all they do, a chemical engineer, etc. So that we're sure that some of your processes, your coatings, etc., do get their protection. So if that person wants to reach out to us, with further explanation on that, let us know. What do you think about Lordstown Motors? Will they be viable, Mike?
Yeah, that's a timely question right now. I know between a lot of these new startups and SPACs are getting a lot of scrutiny right now. They're in our forecast. So they were on that slide. We've got them in the forecast at about 20,000 units in terms of pickup truck volume. And again, more on that sort of light commercial vehicle. So there are commercial applications. I can tell you the concept behind it in terms of an electric vehicle for pickup truck use, particularly more in the commercial segment, has a lot of appeal and has legs to it. Lordstown, I know there's some extra scrutiny there, not just with Lordstown, with others as well. As I'm currently assessing it, yeah, we do have them kind of in the mix and certainly still being a survivor, if you will. And again, kind of in that 20,000 unit a year range. And it's really incumbent upon them and others in that space to, again, find a viable business, business plan, if you will, under those volumes. Now, that may extend, that maybe perhaps they can move into the medium duty truck segment as well, which would be outside of our light vehicle forecast. But as it currently stands on the light vehicle side, we're having at about 20,000 a year.
Thanks. Mike, I'm going to ask you one more question before, actually, this is kind of for both of you. A lot of our members and others on the phone have talked to us about labor shortages. They just can't find people to work or train people to work, people that pass drug tests, etc. Lots of issues on labor. They also have some issues with steel, with resin, and some other challenges. So in a sense, we're facing this perfect storm of, at the same time, we have, a multiple supply chain bottlenecks. And the question is this a coincidence or has something fundamentally changed?
Well, I'll chime in on part of this because I've been trying to study it more and more since all this kind of really shook out back half of last year and into the early part of this year. Coincidence, this is a function of taking the market down last year. It really is. It's something for those in supply chain and studying supply chain, it's something called the bullwhip effect. And it's sort of like the butterfly effect. A small impact in one area can have broader impacts elsewhere. And really that's I think a big portion of the component issues that we're feeling right now. Now there's some other ancillary issues and they're alluded to within the question. Labor availability, heck, I could talk to probably a lot of people on this phone, on this call before the pandemic, they were having issues finding labor. So that is not new in and of itself, but it's gotten arguably a bit worse when you're finding it even more challenging in a high unemployment environment to find those workers. And then again, as we started to kind of emerge from the shutdowns last year, one of the things that we became increasingly concerned about, and I don't care if you're General Motors down to XYZ, raw material supplier, that startup process and incorporating those COVID containment measures, taking everybody, making sure everything is, all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed, which are very important. I'm not belittling them, have an impact on your operations. So we were seeing that in terms of throughput, even at the automaker level, where we would see that ramp up and that process. It was a little bit more lackluster. We weren't seeing that return to normalcy even at a vehicle production side. And then again, you start going down the supply chain. There's been a meaningful impact there. So I do think, I guess, in terms of how do you classify it, I think coincidental because of the fact of just the magnitude of us going through that shutdown and then the reboot process.
If I can chime in, a couple of points. One, and those of you who have seen me speak at other events have probably heard me say this before, but the automotive manufacturing model of just-in-time production of highly engineered, very difficult to resource components is the most efficient production model created in the history of man, so long as nothing goes wrong, at which time it is utterly fault intolerant. And every time there's a disaster, I would go back to 2009 or 2010 when those horrible tsunamis hit Japan, the industry says to itself, gee, is this just-in-time model really the right one? Is it worth the risk that we're taking? And ultimately, they keep on coming back to the answer of yes, because as long as nothing goes wrong, it's cheaper. I can tell you, I have spoken to senior people in the industry in the last several weeks who, at least in high value things like chips, are, I think, coming to the conclusion that we can't go through this again. If we have to hold an inventory, and one way or the other have to be compensated for holding an inventory, we've just got to do it. I don't think that we're going to completely abandon the just-in-time model, but it's not going to come through unscathed. As far as labor, it's what I hear most about these days. And part of I have people telling me that we offer very generous premiums. Show up and we'll show up 5 days in a row and there'll be something in the paycheck for you. And it's just not working. The business people, and I won't opine on their perception, believe it's strongly tied to the generosity of governmental benefits that are available right now. There's folks who have just, a fair number of folks who have just decided that, for what you're willing to pay me, it's not worth it to get out of bed and come to work. That's probably lives in a different world than the raw material portion. And then the last thing I'll make, which is another way of saying this, is what should my contract say about force majeure? And there's a lot more, provisions that have been unchanged for 70 years and no one's read them in the last 50 years are suddenly being read very carefully to figure out who's nickel. All of these failures in supply who's going to bear the cost. And it's not boilerplate, it's not nonsense. It's one of many provisions that actually serve a business purpose and are worth negotiating over and are worth giving thought to. And perhaps it's worth walking away from the table. In terms of negotiating, and I'll wrap this up very quickly. I'm probably going over long. If your customer doesn't think it's possible that you'll walk away from the table, what incentive does your customer have to negotiate with you? I know no one likes to walk away from money, and no one likes to walk away from money because it's possible that down the road something bad might happen. But if the customer knows I'll say no and he'll do the business anyways, that's not a good negotiating position, and a lawyer can't solve that problem.
Thank you, Sheldon. And you're right, I've been seeing a lot of people, a lot of the clients have been saying that they're, being asked to warehouse things, what have you, because of the shortages. Okay, next question. What special comments about INC damage claims if the parties have not agreed to cap them?
I don't quite understand by what comments.
Well, I guess they're asking, so if you have INC damage claims, if the parties have not agreed to cap them, I'm trying to think that, well, I guess INC damage claims.
The answer is if you haven't agreed to cap them, they're not capped. And I don't mean to be glib, but your customers' terms probably say you are responsible for every conceivable type of damages to the maximum possible extent. And if you don't get something in your contract that says, no, that's not true, whether it's a dollar cap or excluding particular types of damages or anything else, I mean, the law allows very expansive damages unless the parties agree otherwise.
All right, thank you. Hey, Jonathan, can you mute people who are not speaking so we don't have that back voice? I'm not sure if that's possible or not, or quite what's causing it. Thanks. All right, next question. We experience that acceptance of terms is expected from potential customers before they'll even issue a supply code or send out RFQs. Is there any chance to circumvent such behavior or contradict such terms later on? Another Sheldon question.
To some extent, it depends on how on the ball your customer is. If you are submitting a bid for General Motors and your submission in the comment box says, but I'm not accepting terms X, Y, and Z, you will probably get a call back very quickly from your buyer saying, take that back or you're off the bid list. And they, if they police it properly and they have the power to enforce that, they have the power to enforce that. I mean, there's nothing that says a contract has to be fair to you if it's a contract that you agreed to. Not all customers police it as efficiently as General Motors and others. I'm not saying they're unique. And so should you make your objections? Should you continue to object so long until the point that your customer says, I hear one more word out of you and I'm taking my business and going down the road? Yeah, I mean, there is legal advantage in trying to create a battle with the forms with all of the vulnerabilities and uncertainties I described. But if your customer says, I'm not playing that game, ultimately, if they can do it.
Okay, thank you. Mike, one of the questions, we have some questions on electric vehicles, and I think it's also because you see the administration is really pushing for green energy, electrification, et cetera, in a lot of different ways. And I do want to say that I have just ordered a Mustang Mach-E. It's supposed to take 12 weeks for delivery. Let's see if they really do. But the question is that what will be the catalyst resulting in a greater adoption of these electric vehicles in the US?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of the question. I touched on all those models that are coming down the pike, but it is going to have to, at some point, the customer has to take the baton. So we need to talk about customer adoption. And I do think it's going to be a combination. Charging infrastructure, which the Biden administration they're going to talk about more. You're going to hear more about that. And then technology development, what we're seeing with General Motors and Tesla and really a wide variety of automakers in terms of really pushing down that battery cost and improving the battery efficiencies. So it's all about removing objections. Beth, if you weren't able to drive that Mach-E more than 100 miles, or if you didn't have a place to plug it in, you're not going to be inclined to do that. And I'm mindful of the fact people will talk about, well, and I'm playing devil's advocate on both sides. People will say, well, people only drive 20 miles, in a given day, or 40 miles in a given day. So therefore, an EV works perfectly well for them. And in a rational world, that makes sense. We are not rational people in the US. And I would argue anywhere in terms of buying vehicles. We pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a vehicle that depreciates immediately when you leave the dealership. And there's more to the vehicle buying process than how much you drive in a given day. It's having the peace of mind, being able to get in your car and go, knowing you can go to every street corner and refill it in 5 minutes at a gas station. So we have to overcome those objections. So it is those kind of things that charging infrastructure, bringing down the cost, some of that is going to be incentive based as well. And then really compelling product. And ironically enough, or maybe unironically enough, the compelling product is coming, and Mustang Mach-E is a great example of that. You're going to see it with the Hummer EV. So no longer is it just these penalty boxes with a battery that we're buying, and not to besmirch those vehicles, but we're getting into the heart of the market: utility vehicles and pickup trucks. So with that, with charging infrastructure, and with talking about some of those other factors, I think that will help with that adoption process. And then again, still having internal combustion as part of the equation for at least a period of time.
Thanks, Mike. And as a follow-up to this, one of our participants has commented that, they hear that the combustible engine has about 1,200 parts, yet the electric vehicle only has about 400 parts in the powertrain.
Yeah.
How is this reduction going to impact the auto suppliers?
There's a multitude of impacts. It's forcing suppliers, whether you're a combustion supplier right now, think of like an exhaust supplier or something along those lines. They're having to think about, how do I go about targeting maybe battery trays or the battery cooling system or other features that way. The sheer reduction in the number of components is absolutely accurate. That has implications within the manufacturing process for an automaker. Suddenly their labor and headcount profile looks a little different. Think about it from a dealer perspective. You don't have the same type of service on these vehicles either. There's no oil change. There's no tranny fluid to change. There are, brakes are a different equation. So those are different discussions as well. So the whole value chain is really having to assess and really evolve in this process too.
You really kind of pegged me. On one hand, I'm thinking I don't have to do my oil change, but on the other one, I'm kind of nervous about, I can't drive up north on one tank of, electric charge. What am I going to do? So good discussion on that one. The next question is, can you discuss, this is a Sheldon question, can you discuss impossibility or impracticability related to extreme supply cost fluctuation, alternative shipping cost, etc.? Even when there's price fluctuation, are the results of unanticipated extreme market conditions? What is that? And that's a great question, because that's what people are saying right now. Some of the costs are going up 50% or more. And it's like, are we, is this a force majeure? Can we go ahead and ask for more money? What's going on?
Okay, so first, impracticability and possibility. I have partners of mine who disagree when I say this, but they're just newfangled, complicated ways of saying force majeure. It is, the law is extremely unfavorable to claiming cost as a force majeure excuse. The same text that I quoted from in terms of drink a martini, says, and I can't, martinis I can quote from memory, the other I can't, but make the basic obvious point: if you enter into a long-term fixed price contract, you necessarily assume, and probably should recognize that you have assumed, the risk of input cost fluctuations in making that decision to enter into that contract. I'm not lecturing the audience. I'm basically saying how a court, an economist, a scholar assesses that. There is, with a handful of oddball cases, basically nothing in the law that says 50% or 100% or 200% and it's force majeure. Some of you who may have been in the business long enough to remember back to the mid 2000s, steel prices were going up 40% a month for a significant period of time. Heard various explanations for that, but if you were in the business of bending steel and your cost of materials were 80% of your total costs, it was crippling, but the law didn't offer significant relief. The best argument you have, in my experience, is hope like heck that your customer recognizes that you're better off alive than dead, and works things out commercially, because your off-the-shelf force majeure language isn't going to help you, or at least I wouldn't bet on you in court. Beth, you went mute.
One of the most popular sayings of 2020. Um, Thank you, Sheldon. Unfortunately, Mike has a hard stop at 3:30, so we are going to lose him now. And I know that at least one person has asked a question about availability by branch for governments.
I can answer that one quick. I do expect that's going to be addressed by the Biden administration. We're already hearing rumblings about either expanding that 7,500 to 10,000, and or removing the cap. So possibly bringing General Motors and Tesla back in the fold. It wouldn't surprise me to see that addressed in the next round of, call it spending or infrastructure or the high energy vehicles bill that they're working on.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, thanks. We appreciate you being on this. Sheldon, you still have time to stay on for a little while.
Sure.
So we'll talk about terms and conditions. Mike's already gone, so there you go. You know, the next question is a really interesting question because this was being discussed a lot before the election, and now it continues to be discussed. And that has to do with, higher corporate tax. We have a really low corporate tax. Now with the Biden administration, they're talking about raising the corporate tax. And, what is that going to do for some of our suppliers? Are they going to want to move out of the US or not? Sheldon and I have not discussed this at all. I have heard from some of our top tier 1 suppliers that they had, and some investment bankers that they had, booked and planned long before the election on the taxes going up to 28%. And they kind of felt that that is where it should be. And so they're prepared for that. But that's what I've heard from some of those players. And Sheldon might have a 180-degree different opinion. So Sheldon, what's your thoughts?
My thoughts are this is way past my pay grade. I have my personal political thoughts as to tax policy, but I have no informed thoughts as to the specific question.
Yeah, so I guess we're not sure. We have to wait and see, but I can tell you, as I said, from a number of pretty, some of our very, very top tier 1 suppliers, that they anticipated this, and but we'll just see. So the next question is about force majeure, which is something we were talking about constantly for the last year, especially March, April, May, when who knew what would happen. So you want to kind of talk about that? Do you consider COVID force majeure event?
It is very much going to depend on what the connection between COVID and your supply failure was. COVID meaning it was illegal to maintain manufacturing operations for a period of time. It's going to be sorted out in the courts, but that is a pretty strong argument for a force majeure, unless, for example, you have another factory across the state line and you can move production there and they are allowed to operate. Does that change the story? Well, I don't know. The point is facts matter. In terms of some of the less directly connected disruptions, such as labor, I think it's a more difficult case, but again, it's going to be very highly fact specific. I do want to make one force majeure point that's which is this. We talked a couple questions ago about the fact that rising costs alone are not a force majeure excuse, or at very least it's a very hard case to make. A different question, and I think a far more interesting question, is posed when the question is, do you have to modify the products? Do you have a product which calls for type 123 resin, and your customer says, well, I know you can't get 123 resin, but go buy 124 resin at twice the price. Do you have to do that, and do you have to do it on your nickel? I'm not going to answer that question, in part because it's not a question that's clearly answered in the law, but in my mind, it's a very different question from the question of whether I have to buy 123 resin at twice the price is a different question of, can they make me buy 124 resin at twice the price? And those are real world examples that are going on right now in certain of resins and other steel, other very raw material types of supply chain bottlenecks. So, and I'm not shilling for business. However, it's a question we've been dealing with, and I'm glad to talk to whomever if they're facing those sorts of situations.
Thank you, Sheldon. Okay, one last question. And this has to do again with labor. And first I want to point out, Sheldon's in our corporate. I am like a generalist corporate type of thing, because whatever question some of you call me, I kind of field, and then I get the right people on. And it has to do with labor, and essentially, what have people found that works to attract and keep labor, to have them show up every Monday and all week long? And, where can we find them? And I've got a lot, Sheldon had mentioned one thing, bonuses for working the entire week. Some have raised the hourly rate. Some have had things like raffles, etc., on Fridays, so that actually on Mondays, because so they come in on Mondays, kind of thing. Some have given a a lot of them, if you look around at your own shops, how many people there are related to other people, or are friends of other people, or are in the same neighborhood as other employees? And a lot of people have found that if they offer some type of signing bonus to their employees, if they find somebody that they pay finder's fees, that has worked for them, because they tend to get their friends, and people like to work together. And and then again, if they stay for over 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and there's another bonus, whatever. So then the friends kind of invested to be more of a mentor to them and make sure they show up at work and do a good job and learn. But then there's other sources, such as going to, working with some of the nonprofits, whether it be returning citizens or, people with other issues, that you work with them. And so that has worked for some as well. And Sheldon, I don't know if you've had any other things that you've seen that has worked.
For some reason, my clients only tell them about things that don't work. So no, I have nothing to add.
But we're going to plan a seminar on that, or a webinar. Probably will be part of the Surface Finishers Midwest Conference. And if others have issues on that, reach out to me. We can talk about it and see if we can do a webinar or address that, or maybe have some other specialist in that, other employment specialist in, or employment placement people in, that can also talk to you about what works. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Again, if you look on the website, you will find the PowerPoint. You'll find a copy of this recording, but you need to wait a little bit for that to be, like, wait till tomorrow or something, because I don't know how long it takes. And I think we've got everything. Thanks so much, everybody. And you're right, it is weird always talking to a computer and not knowing who's there. But thank you. We're all done. Jonathan?